Coming up on the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast.
But meat does have a factor which I think needs to be accounted for that can be potentially dangerous, and that is meat is very high also in methionine, cysteine, especially the muscle meats, and tryptophan. Tryptophan is the only amino acid that is carcinogenic, and is basically, I think if you're eating a meat diet and you're eating, I don't know, 200, 300 grams of protein daily, you're probably getting maybe about a gram of tryptophan, which I think is more than optimal. And the reason I say that, I'm sorry, it's less than optimal. In other words, it's bad for you, because the multiple studies have shown, and even in humans now, recently confirmed, that tryptophan restriction can mimic all of the life-extending benefits of caloric restriction. In other words, and the same thing was seen for methionine restriction and for cysteine restriction. In fact, if you restrict methionine, you can cure type 2 diabetes in humans. There is a great study, and reverse obesity. A lot of these people that the study looked at were morbidly obese. So if you're eating predominantly meat, you're going to be getting probably more than what you need for optimal health of these 3 amino acids.
Hello, and welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I'm Brian Grin, and I'm here to give you actionable tips to get your body back to what it once was 5, 10, even 15 years ago. Each week, I'll give you an in-depth interview with a health expert from around the world to cut through the fluff and get you long-term sustainable results. This week, I have a friendly debate between Bioenergetic Health Researcher Georgi Dinkov and the Neurosurgeon Carnivore, Dr. Anthony Chaffee. We discuss differences between a carnivore diet and a pro-metabolic diet, along with 3 amino acids that might get too high on a carnivore diet, the importance of collagen in your diet, is excess sugar or cortisol causing obesity, aspirin's role in lowering lipolysis, lowering PUFAs to obtain optimal health, and much, much more. Well, I really enjoyed this debate between Georgi and Dr. Anthony. I know you will too. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the show. All right, welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. My name is Brian Grin. I have Georgi Dinkov on and Dr. Anthony Chaffee. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah. Second time around for both of you. Georgi. No, yeah, second time for Georgi, I think, too. I'm excited to have you both on. I think most of the people listening have an idea of, sort of your background, but maybe just a brief synopsis. I know, obviously, Dr. Chaffee, full-on carnivore, and Georgi's from sort of the bioenergetic viewpoint. Maybe just give a small intro of sort of your reasonings why you sort of got into that style of eating or that thought process. So, Dr. Chaffee, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, so I've spent quite a long time studying nutrition and biology. I studied nutrition in my undergraduate degree, and obviously as pre-med, you generally study a lot of biology. So I was quite interested in that. I was interested in that because I was also an athlete, and I wanted to fuel my body with the best thing possible. Now, as a clinician, it's one of the more powerful tools that I've seen in getting people healthy is cleaning up their diet. And there's a number of different ways to do that. And I've come to the conclusion that I think just a meat-based approach, as many or most of our ancestors did, is probably the best way of doing it. I certainly don't think it's the only way of doing it. However, I do think that it's one of the better ways, if not the best way. Reason being is just that plants we've evolved and are biologically designed to eat meat. There are a lot of examples of that in current traditional populations going back hundreds of years, thousands of years. Before the ice ages, really wasn't more to eat than meat. And we not only survived, but we thrived, which is very hard to do in an ice age if you're not very, very healthy. And then studying botany, biology, cancer biology in my undergraduate degree, it became clear that plants are living organisms. They like to stay living organisms, and they defend themselves by using chemical means, amongst other things. And those things can be harmful to us, some more than others. But most plants on Earth are actually toxic and deadly. And the ones that are edible are less so, obviously, but we have more defenses against them. But that doesn't mean that they're completely benign. And so I just try to raise awareness about that fact. And especially when people are more sensitive to that, have autoimmune issues, and other sort of medical conditions, it can be quite helpful if they just cut out all plant material and just go to a high-fat, meat-based diet. And I found that to be very effective in my practice.
Thanks for sharing that. And Georgi, maybe a little bit about the bioenergetic viewpoint.
I think it actually overlaps quite a bit with what Dr. Chaffee just said. For some reason, people think that the bioenergetic or the Fruitarian diet is somehow anti-meat. It is not. In fact, we think it's better to probably eat a meat-based diet as long as you factor in a couple of things. Number one, some insoluble fiber in order to stimulate intestinal motility. When you're eating a high protein, high meat diet, you certainly don't want your digestion to slow because the microbiome can produce some pretty toxic compounds from meat, such as putrescine, cadaverine. Just the names are basically kind of telling you that these are kind of toxic amines that can be produced from meat if your digestion is not fast enough. And the bioenergetic view basically says you eat all the meat you want as long as you ensure that your digestion is quick, so you process the meat properly. Number one. Number two, make sure you're eating sufficient amount of carbs because the protein, if you're not eating sufficient amount of carbohydrates, protein is very insulinogenic, at least the one that is in meat is. So it's going to raise your insulin, and basically once the blood glucose drops, you're going to get a stress reaction. And also if you don't eat sufficient amount of carbohydrates with the meat, part of the protein will get metabolized into glucose through the process of gluconeogenesis. And that we don't want that because the process of deamination of a lot of these amino acids that are in the meat is actually pretty toxic, and you're going to be producing a lot of ammonia. In fact, there's several studies published on the fact that if you eat too much meat and not enough carbs, you can get into a hyperammonemic state, which I think Dr. Chaffee would agree is certainly not optimal. So the bioenergetic view really, it can be kind of fit into the carnivore paradigm as long as we're taking care of the fiber, as long as we're taking care of the carbohydrates, and also finally meat has I would say a suboptimal ratio of calcium to phosphorus in favor of the phosphorus, and the phosphorus can have an anti-metabolic effect. So if you're going to be eating meat, the bioenergetic view says make sure you supplement with sufficient amount of calcium, so that the ratio of calcium to phosphorus is at least 1-to-1. Not as in this, basically, if you're eating only meat or predominantly meat, I think you're going to be eating a calcium to phosphorus ratio that's basically 1-to-4 in favor of phosphorus, and we don't think that's optimal. My background is entirely, what should I call it, informal. My academic training is in computer science, but when I graduated, I basically was looking for a job in the early 2000s. That was right after the dot-com crash. Nobody wanted to hire people like me. So I had to become a programmer for a biomedical research foundation. That was actually the name. And I was working with 40 to 50 of some of the brightest doctors and biochemists and geneticists that were here in the United States. And a lot of them were coming from international institutions too. So I spent 3 years with these people, and I was only one of two people that were non-medically inclined there. And I wanted to learn the lingo and get involved in the conversations. And they gave me a few books to read. And I started going to the lectures, and then after that, has been reading PubMed studies, and now lately, over the last 2 or 3 years, doing my own studies actually in vivo and in vitro with a lab out in Asia. So that's really my background. It's entirely as a hobby, and actually my day job is in the IT sector.
Thanks, Georgi.
Oh, former athlete, just like Dr. Chaffee, and actually I was more or less 100% carnivore circa 2009, 2010. But I made the mistake of going very low carb, and that actually kind of created problems for me. So since then, I've moved, away from the low carb diet. But I certainly eat meat, so I would probably be considered about 80% carnivorous diet if we look at the macronutrients that are being covered by the pure carnivore diet. So yeah, I would say our dietary habits probably overlap a lot more than people will think on the surface, just based on what people know about the carnivore diet and the bioenergetic one.
Thanks, Georgi. Dr. Chaffee, any thoughts about that? I mean, I'll let you speak. I don't. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, look, I certainly think that a lot of that has merit. I mean, specifically, with the protein, if you are getting too high of protein, that can cause problems. I mean, you do make when you're clipping off these amino groups, they do go into ammonia. Then you turn that into urea. You excrete that. Higher urea is actually okay, though. It's actually a very good antioxidant. Obviously, you don't want it in the ammonia phase, but then when it gets into the urea, it's actually quite beneficial. If you are eating enough fat, though, you can have enough carbs to offset the protein. You can also have enough fat to offset the protein as well. And there's certainly things about, rabbit starvation or protein poisoning where people are really just predominantly getting the majority of their calories from protein. That can certainly cause problems, but you don't generally see that if people are getting enough fat. So I think that you can get enough fat or enough carbohydrates and not have that issue with protein. And there are certainly traditional groups like the Inuit or the Maasai who eat a very high fat diet, not much carbs. The National Academy of Science and the Institute of Medicine and National Academies have said that the lower limit of carbohydrates is essentially 0, that these traditional populations don't eat any carbs, don't eat them generationally, and apparently don't have any sort of health ramifications from that as long as they're getting enough protein and fat. So that's obviously the caveat, is you need the rest of the macronutrients. As far as the bowels are concerned, I've found in my practice and in myself that if you do eat enough fat to the point that your body absorbs all the fat that's it's wanting to, right? We have a limited capacity to absorb fat with the bile that we have. And once we run out of that, it's difficult for our bodies to absorb fat. You can absorb some, but it's small fraction of the amount of fat that goes out. And that fat actually lubricates things, keeps things soft, and moves things through. So I find that people have quite normal stools. It's also important to note that yes, those putrefaction processes can happen. They generally happen when you're eating a mixed diet with a lot of fiber, actually, and a lot of digestive disruptors and protease inhibitors that stop your body from absorbing these sorts of things in the first place. Otherwise, if you're just eating meat, you generally absorb around 98% of the meat that you're eating. Dr. Salisbury in the 1800s actually got this up by grinding meat in such a way that it filtered out the gristle, and basically people were absorbing 100% of the meat that they were eating. So it didn't get down to their colon in the first place, so it didn't get that process. There can be a problem with putrefaction. Apart from that, we don't generally see that as much if people are eating enough fat and they're not eating other things that can block digestion. And as far as ratios, I would agree. In a lot of different ways, you need very specific ratios. If you are eating a different diet or a mixed diet, you generally need a different constellation of proteins, but also vitamins and minerals as well. There are a lot of reasons for this. Our body metabolizes nutrients differently depending on what we eat. There are different things in plants that can actually disrupt the absorption of different minerals, like oxalates can bind calcium, strip them out of your body. That can actually strip them out of your bones. There's studies in the 1950s giving people a lot of spinach because spinach is high in calcium. And they said, okay, well, we'll give them, is this a good source of calcium? They'll raise their calcium levels. And they found their actually calcium levels dropped because they were bound up in ways that weren't bioavailable. And the oxalates were actually stripping calcium out of their serum as well. So, I would agree with that, but with the caveat that we haven't really studied exactly what the ratios are necessary for if you are only eating meat. Look at vitamin C. People say, well, there's not enough vitamin C in meat. Well, if you're going by the RDAs, that's true. But if you understand the fact that carbohydrates block out the absorption and utilization of vitamin C because they both get drawn in by the GLUT4 receptor, and carbohydrates can drown out the vitamin C. So you need an abundance of vitamin C to get enough in. And that vitamin C in the context of scurvy catalyzes the hydrolyzation of proline and lysine to make properly bound collagen. But if you're eating a lot of meat, you're getting that pre-hydrolyzed proteins, and you don't need as much. So you need milligrams of vitamin C if you're eating carbohydrates, and you need nanograms of vitamin C if you're not. So there's a millionfold difference there, and it would be good to study the ratios that we need on a carnivore diet with these other things as well. And I think you'll find that they probably work out just well. I mean, I have patients that were vegan, anorexic. They were borderline osteoporotic at 40 years old. They were carnivore for 1 year, and they're borderline normal bone densities. And that's a massive change. And in medicine, we say and we teach that you can only build bone density up to the age of 25, and then you just start losing it. But that is exactly the opposite of what we see in practice. And, again, we have these populations like the Inuit, like people going through the ice ages, that some of them exclusively ate meat, others were close to it, and they did very, very well. And, they had very strong bones, and we have their bones in the fossil record. And it was actually after agricultural revolution that they became more short stature, smaller brains, and weaker bones, and more signs of fractures and poor wound healing, tuberculosis, things like that. And so it does appear that before the agricultural revolution, when people were predominantly eating meat, and then during the ice ages, when really, if you're really up north, you're exclusively eating meat because there's nothing else to eat, people were actually thriving. And so I think that there's a difference there. And so if you're only eating meat, I would argue that you get, everything that you need in the proportion that you need it.
Okay, a couple of things from me. I agree 100% with the statement that if you eat meat, you're going to be healthier than if you're eating vegetables, especially with the current craze of eating the vegetables mostly raw. That's abysmal to me. I mean, as you mentioned, there are many metabolic inhibitors inside. The vegetables are actually the largest source of phytoestrogens, and there are these phenolic molecules, naturally occurring estrogens that are ubiquitous. So if you're going to be eating a plant, chances are you're ingesting more than optimal, if you think estrogen is even optimal to start with, a more than optimal amount of phytoestrogens. And no matter what the medical industry is trying to tell you that phytoestrogens are good for your bones, good for your breasts, etc., we're finding the opposite is true with things like soy consumption. It shrinks male testicles, causes male and female infertility. There was a big craze of feeding women soy, menopausal women soy, because it replaces their supposedly naturally declining estrogen. That actually resulted in skyrocketing rates of breast cancer, estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. So really, if you have to choose between eating plants and eating meat, to me, it's a non-brainer. You go with the meat, you're going to be healthier 10 days out of 10. A couple of things about the culture of consuming mostly meat. I've actually looked at this, and I did some studies on various meats myself. I think there's a bit of a myth that meat is low in carbs. Fresh meat, which is up to a week after the animal has been slaughtered, is actually very high glycogen content. Glycogen is mostly stored in the liver and the muscles. So if you're consuming fresh meat, you're consuming a sufficient amount of carbs. So I think that can actually probably account for the fact that you can eat only meat diet, and as long as it's fresh meat diet, you're actually probably going to be thriving, especially compared to eating plants. It's also relatively high levels of vitamin C in the meat as well. That may also kind of explain why, if you're eating predominantly meat diet, if it's fresh meat, you don't have as much need to consume preformed vitamin C. However, if the meat is aged, cured, or in general, meat basically is after a week old, it can reliably cause scurvy, which kind of shows that there's something going on in the meat, probably due to the putrefaction and maybe degradation of vitamin C, because the molecule resembles carbohydrates so much. And most of the expeditions that were on these ships that lasted months or even years back in the 14, 15, 1600s, a lot of sailors were getting scurvy, even though their diet was actually mostly dry, cured meat. So they had to start carrying these citrus fruits with them to basically cure the scurvy before the vitamin C was isolated. So fresh meat is great. Aged meat, I would say not so much. Another thing that there's some publications on, and that I confirmed with my studies, is that after about 9 days, the amount of endotoxin in the meat starts to rise. And I think the reason is there's bacteria that starts to grow and feed on the meat. And the gram-negative bacteria that processes the amino acids in the process of increasing its turnover, because the bacterial colony starts to grow when you feed it, of course, they release endotoxin. And endotoxin is definitely not good, not something we want to get into a bloodstream. Yes, we are eating the meat, and a lot of doctors will probably say, well, you're not absorbing that much because it will stay in the gastrointestinal tract. Studies have shown that that's not true. If you're eating aged steak, the endotoxemia in the blood rises. So you're getting, basically, you can detect 5 to 6 times higher endotoxin than if you're not eating the aged meat. The same thing is not seen with fresh meat. So I think it really matters whether you're eating fresh meat or not. If you're not eating fresh meat, if you're eating aged, cured, etc., other meats that have stayed in an environment where bacteria has access to that meat, then you're probably drastically decreasing the benefits of that meat. As far as the Maasai, from what I understand, their diet, it actually includes a lot of milk, blood, and meat. So the milk has quite a bit of lactose, so I think they're getting some of the sugar from there as well. And also the fresh meat, which from what I understand, Maasai actually sometimes eat even raw, and they prefer it raw. This is very, very fresh meat. So I think they're getting probably a sufficient amount of carbohydrates based on the concentration of sugar that we're seeing in fresh meat. They're getting protein to carb ratio of about 1 to 2, which is perfect. without them having to consume additional preformed sugar. Well, obviously they're living in the wild, but from what I'm saying, they don't even prefer to eat ripe fruit. They're perfectly fine on drinking their milk, drinking the blood, mixing milk with blood. I think it's one of their famous drinks, and also eating the fresh meat. So as long as you're eating the fresh meat, I think as far as the macronutrients are concerned, almost everything is covered, except potentially the calcium to phosphorus. But Dr. Chaffee says we don't know yet what is optimal. And that's true. I don't think there have been any studies saying like, well, let's feed these people a calcium deficient diet and then pump them full of phosphorus and see what happens. I don't think a study like that has happened. Most of the evidence that I cite of the ratio being anti-metabolic, if you increase phosphorus too much, is from in vitro studies and animal studies. We haven't had a human study. I would agree with that. But meat does have a factor which I think needs to be accounted for that can be potentially dangerous, and that is meat is very high also in methionine, cysteine, especially the muscle meats, and tryptophan. Tryptophan is the only amino acid that is carcinogenic, and is basically, I think if you're eating a meat diet and you're eating, I don't know, 200, 300 grams of protein daily, you're probably getting maybe about a gram of tryptophan, which I think is more than optimal. And the reason I say that, I'm sorry, it's less than optimal. In other words, it's bad for you, because multiple studies have shown, and even in humans now, recently confirmed, that tryptophan restriction can mimic all of the life-extending benefits of caloric restriction. In other words, and the same thing was seen for methionine restriction and for cysteine restriction. In fact, if you restrict methionine, you can cure type 2 diabetes in humans. There is a great study, and reverse obesity. A lot of these people that the study looked at were morbidly obese. So if you're eating predominantly meat, you're going to be getting probably more than what you need for optimal health of these 3 amino acids. And they're, as far as the methionine and the cysteine, they're known to be anti-thyroid. They're suppressing the release of thyroid hormones from the thyroid gland. So the way this was traditionally balanced, I think, in the cultures is that these cultures consumed also a lot of collagen, right? So they were eating the meat, but they're also eating a lot of the connective tissue. They're eating a lot of skin. And if that is the case, then a lot the glycine, the proline, the hydroxyproline in the gelatin can actually offset a lot of those pro-inflammatory, anti-metabolic effects that methionine, cysteine, and tryptophan have. But if you're eating pure muscle meat, you're getting basically a lot of these suboptimal of these 3 amino acids in quantities that are basically probably having potentially a negative effect on your health, unless they're being balanced by these other amino acids, which are known to be anti-inflammatory, such as glycine, proline, and hydroxyproline. Taurine is another very similar one. They all happen to be, by the way, all these anti-inflammatory amino acids all happen to be GABA agonists, alanine, glycine, and taurine, while methionine, cysteine, and tryptophan are GABA antagonists. So they're going to put your brain into a state of a little bit of excitotoxicity, if I could say that, if you're eating too much of those amino acids and they're not being balanced by the anti-inflammatory amino acids. So I think we're largely in agreement. It's just a question of, okay, how much meat you're eating? Is it fresh, right? And also, basically, are you doing something to putting the calcium to phosphorus issue aside, because there are no human studies yet that show what is the optimal ratio. I think the other thing that I would potentially worry about is the excess of these 3 amino acids, because they're mostly present in muscle meats. But if you're consuming organ meats, if you're consuming collagen, right? If you're eating the whole animal, which is what traditionally is done in these, we call them primitive cultures, but I think they're very smart. We're the primitive ones. We're eating crap. I think it's perfectly fine as a diet. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thanks, Georgi. Dr. Chaffee, did you have anything, or yeah?
Oh yeah, no, just a couple comments. I agree with a lot of that, and I do think that that one of the things we need to again consider is that some of these studies are looking at the different ratios and different benefits of tryptophan and all these sorts of things. They do happen in, well, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in studies that are again in a mixed diet, and so we don't really know exactly, what does this mean for the strict meat eater, because there aren't really enough of us to do that study with, and it's not a big enough population cohort that people find it worthwhile to study that specifically. They're sort of looking in the context of what people do on a normal daily basis. And so as far as the dried and fresh meat is concerned, there are certainly populations that eat fresh meat. I agree with you. The Maasai obviously do have carbohydrates from the lactose. And so that's not a good example of one that doesn't use carbohydrates, but there are others, like the Inuit. They do chew on skin and try to turn that into leather. That's sort of something that they're known for. And the elderly Inuit, if they can't chew their leather, if their teeth are worn out, then they say, okay, that's it. I'm not contributing. So I walk out into the snow and expose myself to nature. So yes, that's definitely something that they do as well. But the Native Americans are, well known for making pemmican. They do a buffalo drop. They'd scare a herd of buffalo over a cliff. They'd fall and die, and they would dry and preserve them. And that's what they would eat for the majority of the year, was dried meat mixed with rendered tallow. And we have evidence of this and mammoth drops going back over 1 million years. And so our ancestors have been, using probably preserved meat, or dried anyway, not with a bunch of chemicals and salts and things like that necessarily, which could possibly throw a wrench in the gears. Adding different sort of preservatives and chemicals is probably not a great idea. But it is likely that we have been doing this for quite some time. We've used these sorts of pemmican iron rations to feed armies. The Napoleonic Wars were basically fed on boiled down cows, put in jars. I think that's the origin of Bovril, if anyone knows that wretched product. And that's what it was sort of shipped all over the world to feed the Napoleon's armies. So that, and then with the endotoxin thing, there is a major issue with gut permeability and leaky gut when you're eating, different sorts of things. So I would wonder if, that those endotoxins wouldn't be kept out in someone who had a robust digestive tract and didn't have that leaky gut. I assume that study was done in someone sort of eating a more, sort of a general diet. So I would wonder about that. Endotoxins, not something you want, right? But and certainly if someone's worried about that, eating more fresh meat is something that they can certainly do. I would wonder, and I would be interested in seeing studies, if someone didn't have leaky gut, would they still get that same endotoxin load? I would wonder that as well. It was my understanding that the sailors getting scurvy were actually mostly eating like gruel and things like that. And it was the officers that had access to meat because they were obviously more important. You have the Vikings going back, 1,000+ years. Leif Erikson making it to North America probably. They predominantly used salted fish and meat and things like that. They had root fish, which was just essentially rotten fish. It just basically tasted like spoiled lox, and that was predominantly what they ate as well. It didn't seem to have those problems as well. And there is some vitamin C again in these sorts of meats. And the thing is too, is that if you look at some of the nutritional data being put out by farmers that are doing regeneratively raised, grass-fed and finished cows, like just their muscle meat actually has a sufficient amount of vitamin C to meet the current RDAs in a mixed diet. So it does matter what you're eating. I don't always get the regeneratively raised meat. I just go to Costco because that's what's around me. It's what's convenient. And I haven't had a problem with that. I haven't had a patient that ever displayed any sort of symptoms of vitamin C deficiency. And there can obviously be more subtle cases. You even suggested that you can develop atherosclerosis on a suboptimal level of vitamin C well before you get scurvy. So it's not necessarily something that you spot right away, but I certainly haven't seen scurvy. And I've been doing this for 6 years now, really just meat and water, mostly muscle meat. I do age it too, slightly. So I put it, sort of do a wet age and a bit of dry brining. I don't like let it go to rot. There are people that do high meat, which like really let it rot, and they swear by it. I don't think I'm there yet. I don't think that's something I need to try. I think I'm feeling pretty good. I don't need another leg up. But there are some people that absolutely swear by it, and they say they feel amazing, and they say they don't want to do it. It's gross. The house stinks, but it's just sort of fixed all their problems, and they feel so much better with it. So I think it's very interesting to think about these things in general. I think it's difficult to glean too much information off of these studies that don't really, compared to what we're thinking about here, which is just a population that's only eating meat. And if you look at different traditional populations, that are predominantly eating meat. And again, I like to go back to the ice ages, and there are different populations that ate sort of different things, and certainly would include some plants or carbs or something like that. But like during the ice ages, really didn't have that available. So maybe it was something to do with the raw meat and eating all the organs, eating nose to tail. But there is evidence of these mammoth drops and people having to, they have to sort of preserve. I mean, I guess you're sort of living in a freezer back in the ice age. You can just sort of leave it there, I guess. But I don't know what that does to it, or if they dried it. But the Native Americans, living in the plains of America, they really did just subside mostly on pemmican, and they didn't really eat much else. Maybe some berries sometimes. There was reports that they would put some in as like a small percentage, like for a festive occasion or a celebration, like a wedding or something like that. But there are many accounts, if you go back to the early American explorers and settlers, talking about how they were actually just amazed that these guys just really didn't eat anything except meat, especially up in what is now southern Canada, when it was like the little ice age, when it was really cold, and it was just like there was nothing but snow for 8-9 months out of the year, or really 9-10 months out of the year. And I remember reading accounts of this actually, back in school, where they were talking about how, well, I understand that during the winter they can't grow anything, so yes, just eat meat the whole time. But there's 3 months in the year that they can live off the bounty of the land and grow crops, but they don't. They really just eat meat the whole year round. The Native Americans and the Plains Indians, they were found in I forget the name of the study, but it was not too long ago. They actually looked at fossil records and historical records. They found that the Plains Indians in the 1800s were the tallest human beings on Earth as a population.
Yeah.
And they were really just eating meat, and they were even eating the dried meat as well. So I think that there's probably a significant difference in the nutritional demand when you're just eating meat, and certainly there is glycogen in muscle meat and liver, and that's probably good for us. I don't doubt that at all. There's probably an argument some people make that if you eat a large bolus of meat in one go, that you'll actually kick yourself out of ketosis and then sort of dip back in. And that's probably physiological, and that's probably good for you. I don't know. I just go by first principles. What are we sort of designed to eat? We've been eating meat for a long time. People have thrived on meat. So I just eat meat. And if my body's going in and out of ketosis, I'm happy that it knows what it's doing. And there are some populations like the Inuit who really can't eat the organs because
too much vitamin A toxicity. They'll get poisoned. Exactly.
Yeah. So the marine mammals that they're eating have such a high concentration of these vitamins, the fat soluble vitamins, they'll get hypervitaminosis A usually. And so they traditionally don't eat the organs. They're really just eating the meat. Now they do chew on the skin, and they'll eat a lot of connective tissue. And there's a bit of a bit more vitamin C and collagen and things like that. So I think these things can be accounted for. And I think that regardless, if you're just eating meat or you're eating anything and you're feeling a bit off or something's off, get checked, check your bloods, see what's going on. If you need to supplement, you do. I've seen exactly 2 people that had actually a folate, slightly low folate. They felt fine. They felt good. But it was just like, okay, eat a bit more liver. They ate more liver, folate came back up. So, certain people are going to metabolize things a little differently. We're not eating wild animals. Mostly aren't getting regeneratively raised. So, there is a bit of a paucity of nutritional components there. And some people, they may find that it's not enough for them. So I think that most people will be just fine though, doing this. And there are populations that have been doing this since, time immemorial.
Agreed. Little doubt that agricultural societies are basically the shortest in stature. They have the shortest lifespan. They have the highest rates of obesity, and generally poor health. Also, very poor dental health. And I remember the Native Americans. One of the things that shocked really the settlers that basically when they look at even very old people, they lost some of their teeth, but there were no cavities in the teeth that were remaining. So the native cultures, knew what to eat. And it looks like when you leave people alone in nature without, them being forced into a particular framework of what they should be eating, they tend to gravitate towards meat, eggs, and milk. And you can see that also in people that live in the mountains, who happen also to be the tallest. Maasai are very tall, even though they're living in the savannah. But if you look at some of the mountainous cultures, they're also very tall. That's what also they predominantly eat: meat, egg, and milk, simply because at that altitude you're probably not going to be able to grow anything. But I think there's also the fact that because I know people who basically they're from Nepal, and they've lived in a very high altitude all their lives. They have a distaste for vegetable. I don't know how to explain it. They don't like it, no matter how you cook it. Even potatoes, they find basically unnatural to eat. And their diets are, just as the doctor said, are basically mostly based on meat and milk and whatever dairy products are coming out of the milk.
I don't like vegetables either.
Well, we know that. One of the things, I mean, obviously there's things that obviously we can agree upon, protein, meat-based diet, the role of saturated fats, limiting PUFAs. But, one of the big differences is the fact that Dr. Chaffee, I've heard you talk on, numerous podcasts that, carbs and sugar are this harmful substance that, make you hungry, overeat, and can be addictive, and almost calling it like a drug. And I don't know if you want to expand on that. And then George, I'd love you to hear your opinion about that.
Well, yeah. I certainly think that there's quite a lot of evidence to show that fructose probably should be classified as a drug. It's been shown to give a dopamine response to the addiction centers of your brain, just like cocaine, heroin, and meth. And there are MRI studies showing that fructose, basically fructose addiction, people who are metabolically sick, can actually kill the same areas of their brain as methamphetamine addicts, and to the same extent as methamphetamine addicts. And God knows how long it took them both to get there. I'm not saying that it's going to necessarily do it as fast, but in this study, they both had the same endpoint, which was, severely damaged area of their brain that relied on dopamine. And as you excite, excitatory molecules to your brain, like dopamine, turn on your brain cells, makes them stay on. This is toxic to the brain. They have to shut down. They have to turn off. You have to sleep. And that gets rid of these sort of toxic neurotransmitter breakdown products, which for some reason, the breakdown products of our neurotransmitters are actually toxic to our brain, which I think is a terrible design. But that's what it is. And so if you're constantly stimulating your brain and your neurons with dopamine, and you're not allowing them to turn off and clean up and repair, they will eventually die. And so that has been shown in MRI studies as well. They can also have hormonal effects. They obviously you eat carbohydrates. This can damage your body. High blood sugar can be dangerous. This is because the glucose molecules physically fuse to other molecules, is where HbA1c comes from. That's the glycated hemoglobin molecules. It's showing that it's a representation of how much damage you've had in your body. Roughly 3 months. There are things that it can extend or shorten the lifespan of a red blood cell and change that average. But that's usually what we look at. We think is about 3 months. And this is what kills diabetics. Just this chronically high blood sugar, and it can, rot you and damage you from the inside. Having high HbA1c, type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome greatly increase your risk for heart disease, metabolic syndrome by 6-fold, type 2 diabetes by 10-fold, which is, similar to smoking. So it's very bad for you. And our body responds by raising insulin. I think this is a sort of a protective mechanism. When you look at different populations, a lot of them aren't eating carbohydrates, from plants or anything like that. And quite often they can be in ketosis. And, and so the, their insulin levels are quite low, and they're chronically, sort of stable, and their body's allowed to sort of run properly. When you raise your insulin, and so I think that's our primary metabolic state. I don't think that's a starvation state or hunger-driven state or anything like that. If I eat, 2 pounds of ribeye, like I'm not starving, and I'm certainly not fasting. I'm eating. So I think we've misnamed that as a fasting state. I think that's our normal metabolic state. That seems to be the normal metabolic state of most animals in the wild. Carnivores, because they eat animals with meat and fat, they go for the fat first. They get a lot of their calories from fat, and the rest from protein. And then herbivores, because that's what they break down fiber into. They don't break down fiber. No vertebrate animal can break down fiber. It's their gut bacteria that eat the fiber, and as a byproduct, they produce short chain fatty acids, and which are saturated fats, and then they die off and are absorbed as protein. So they get, like a gorilla gets about 70-30 fat to protein. Cows get closer to 80-20. And so they eat fiber and they eat carbs, but what they absorb is fat and protein. And that's similar to us as well, in the nature. And so I think that that's on purpose. I think that's our normal biological, biochemical design. When you have very high insulin, this causes a lot of biochemical dysregulation in your body. It can precipitate things like PCOS, erectile dysfunction, hypertension, and a lot of other things. There are a lot of people like Professor Ben Bickman and others who are arguing that a lot of the disease states are driven by a hyperinsulinemic state. And one of the things that insulin can do is it can block a hormone called leptin, which is a satiety hormone, but it's more than that. It's a cornerstone hormone that drives and helps regulate a lot of hormones in our circadian rhythm. And insulin can block that. And so that goes and tells you, it comes from our stretch receptors. If you eat a lot, this is why we were told to eat a lot of fiber in the 1980s. It says you'll stretch out your stomach, release leptin, that'll tell your brain that you're full and you'll stop eating. But you have more receptors that are specifically designed to look at nutrients, macro and micronutrients, that tracks up the vagus nerve to the brain. And so you find that people that eat a whole bunch of vegetables and things like that, they feel full, they can't eat anymore, they're bloated, but they're like, I'm starving, because their brain is just like, you have gotten no nutrients here, right? So that leptin is not enough. Most of the leptin comes from our adipose tissue, from our fat cells, and that goes to our brain and gives us a sort of a running gas gauge on how much energy we have. Insulin blocks that. So our brain gets a signal that we don't have as much fat in storage, or maybe we don't have any fat in storage if you have a high enough insulin response. And, that can tell your brain that, you're not doing well. High insulin is going to stop gluconeogenesis, it's going to stop lipolysis, stop proteolysis, and it's going to lock down your fat cells. And so now you're not able to raise your blood sugar, you're not able to produce ketones, and you feel really hungry and you feel starving. Your brain panics because it says you have no energy reserves and your blood sugar is dropping. So you have to eat now. So people panic eat, they overeat. It's very easy to overeat when you're eating a lot of carbohydrates because of that, especially sugar like fructose, because fructose independently blocks leptin and upregulates ghrelin, which is the counter to leptin in your stretch receptors in your stomach. So when your stomach's empty, it releases ghrelin and it says like, hey, you don't have anything in the pipeline. So that can compound that hunger effect. There are other things in plants, obviously, different lectins that can actually get into your body through leaky gut. Lectins can also cause leaky gut. So it's a 2-for-1. And some of these lectins have been shown in studies to bind to insulin receptors and leptin 5 times more tightly than insulin. So, even if someone's on a ketogenic diet, but they're still eating, plants containing these lectins, they can actually still have this insulin effect, even though their insulin is actually quite low. So I think that in a lot of cases, that when you're reducing your insulin and normalizing your blood sugar and your insulin, and you're gonna normalize a lot of other hormones as well. PCOS, the reason that can be caused by eating a lot of carbohydrates and the genetically susceptible is because women make testosterone first, and then this is converted into estrogen in the ovaries. And high insulin actually blocks the conversion of estrogen or testosterone into estrogen. So they get too high testosterone, they get too low estrogen. It can also screw up your growth hormone production. Carbohydrates, again, stimulate insulin. Insulin blocks the secretion and action of growth hormone, which is a very important hormone in our general health and aging and building and repair of our body and brain. We kick this stuff out cyclically every 60 minutes for men, every 90 minutes for women, and maximally about 2 hours after we go to sleep, and then while we're sleeping. If you're eating carbohydrates, if you're eating carbohydrates and insulin, that's going to block that issue. So you're going to have an inappropriate response, and you might have appropriate, or what you think is appropriate, growth hormone, but your IGF-1 won't be as high. You won't get the effects of growth hormone that you want. And so I think that carbs are problematic. in a lot of ways for that. Certainly in the sense that if you're eating it too much and you're keeping yourself in this hyperinsulinemic state, there are ways around this. There are people that do intermittent fasting, and they, because insulin has a long half-life, it's generally taught in textbooks is about 24 hours of not eating anything, but really just not eating carbohydrates, that your insulin comes down to a more normal level and you can start actually making energy and producing energy from your fat cells. So a lot of people do that by intermittent fasting, and they still eat the same processed food, ultra processed garbage diet, but they get better results. And I think that's part and parcel to do with just keeping your blood sugar at a more normal level and keeping your insulin down as well. So as far as fructose is concerned as well, again, it can compound this issue and make you overeat, but it's addictive like these different sorts of drugs.
Sorry.
And it also can damage your body in similar ways of alcohol. Dr. Robert Lustig of UCSF has done, just yeoman's work. He's done dozens of studies, showing this, that fructose can actually is metabolized and broken down in the same byproducts as ethanol, and that can cause the same damage to our body as these breakdown products of ethanol. Obviously, before they're metabolized, they don't do the exact same things as alcohol, but after they're broken down, they get broken down into the same byproducts. And so you can get fatty liver disease. This just turns straight into fatty droplets. So this is a major contributor to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. You can even get cirrhosis and peripheral insulin resistance, which is type 2 diabetes and heart disease, and is even implicated in things such as cancer and Alzheimer's. So, I think that there are a lot of reasons to sort of avoid these things.
Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to give Georgie a chance. Thank you.
Yeah,
no problem.
That's okay. There's a lot there, Georgie, and I'm sure I'll let you go with that. So
yeah, I get the general idea basically that carbs, called hyperinsulinemia, and basically hyperinsulinemia is tied to all of these, disease states down the line. A couple of things about it. I think sugar gets a lot of blame, and yes, it is high in diabetes, and yes, it is required for the glycated hemoglobin. However, several very interesting studies with humans demonstrated that the rate of increase of glycated hemoglobin sugar is not the only required thing. There needs to be lipid peroxidation. And in people who were given antioxidants, such as vitamin E or vitamin C, they didn't form not nearly as much glycated hemoglobin, despite eating as much as, if not even more, simple carbohydrates than the people that didn't. So there's an interplay there between polyunsaturated fats and glucose, and the PUFA, which is the polyunsaturated, is a required factor for the really pathological rise in glycated hemoglobin. So I think sugar gets it's not an innocent bystander, but it is a partial bystander. It's not the only evil factor here. Something else in regards to diabetes. Yes, blood sugar is high in type 2 diabetes. However, invariably, probably less than 1 in 1,000 type 2 diabetics, 999 of the 1,000 are obese, often morbidly obese. And the reason they have high blood glucose in their bodies, actually they get the high blood glucose even if they don't eat the sugar. For a long time, there was an advocacy for people with type 2 diabetes to not eat sugar because it will contribute to the elevated blood sugar, the blood glucose. However, recent studies discovered that only about 10% of that blood glucose spike in type 2 diabetics is due to the dietary sugar. The other 90% are due to upregulated gluconeogenesis in these morbidly obese people. And if they did some investigation, and it turns out that in morbidly obese people, baseline cortisol is higher than optimal. So if you give morbidly obese people anti-cortisol drugs, they not only do they recover their glucose, the insulin sensitivity, and normalize the blood glucose, they also lose all their excess weight. So it's the fat, really, the extra fat that these people are carrying, that is doing something that's causing the hyperglycemia, and the dietary glucose seems to be playing a very small role so it's a hormonal disease, really. It's not necessarily a dietary thing. Now, of course, the diet can cause it, right, and eventually becomes a vicious circle. But basically, there's a study with diabetics, type 2 diabetics. They gave them 7 grams of aspirin daily, a massive dose. But one of the effects of aspirin is that almost completely blocks lipolysis at these levels. So with these morbidly obese type 2 diabetics, 7 grams of aspirin daily completely normalized their blood glucose, which again, I think demonstrated something related to the fat that's causing this hypoglycemia in type 2 diabetics. And there's a gentleman who published something in the 1960s called the Randall cycle. I think his name is John Randall, and basically says that glucose and fats compete for metabolic machinery at all times. So basically, whichever one of the macronutrients you happen to have in excess at the current time, that's what's going to get metabolized, and the other macronutrient will not. So there's I think at this point there's a lot of evidence that in obese people there is an oversupply of fatty acids. The free fatty acids in the blood are very high in diabetics, both type 1 and type 2. And if you actually do something to lower the amount of these fatty acids, blood glucose drops as well. There is a drug which is a simple derivative of vitamin B3, niacin, and the drug is called Acipimox, ACPIMOX. ACIPIMOX. And if you look at that, it's basically just niacin with an extra hydroxyl group. And what this drug does, just as niacin does, it very reliably lowers lipolysis. And when you give it to type 2 diabetics, they have a drastic decrease in triglycerides, drastic decrease in cholesterol levels, in general, the free fatty acids, and also drop in blood glucose levels. So I think the bioenergetic view here is that glucose gets a bad rap, even though it does have some role in specifically the advanced glycation end products and the glycated hemoglobin. But it's really like the fat and the lower metabolic rate that are actually causing this glucose to go into pathways that is not supposed to be going, or to stay to the bloodstream simply because it cannot get metabolized. Why it cannot get metabolized? Well, because these people are basically, especially the obese people, they have their lipolysis is elevated, so they always have a higher than optimal amount of free fatty acids in the blood. And as long as that is the case, the body cannot metabolize most of the glucose that they're either eating or producing through the process of gluconeogenesis. If you somehow restrain lipolysis, and insulin, by the way, does that, I'll say what I'm bringing this up in a minute, then you can normalize, you can actually completely reverse insulin resistance despite this person maintaining their morbidly obese state. The study with aspirin actually did that. So they gave him 7 grams of aspirin daily for 2 weeks, and at the end of the study, these people, biochemically, at least on the biomarkers, were no longer diabetic. However, they were still morbidly obese. And the moment the aspirin regimen stopped, within a few days, they basically recovered or relapsed to their previous pathological state. Now, insulin, yes, definitely hyperinsulinemia can cause a lot of problems, but some of the most successful drugs, and that Pharma has been trying to chase these drugs for decades, some of the most successful drugs for weight loss, which were currently approved, not for that, they were approved for type 2 diabetes, but it was found that actually they result in weight loss. And the drug Ozempic, which now every Hollywood actor is taking to manage their weight, its main effect is actually increasing insulin release by about 50%. So it will definitely put you in a state of hyperinsulinemia. However, it results in reliable weight loss to the point where now doctors are prescribing it off-label to people who are willing to take this drug even if they're not type 2 diabetic, because it's such a reliable weight loss inducer. So yes, insulin can cause troubles, but I think the role of insulin as a lipolysis inhibitor is actually important. And a lot of people say, well, hold on a second. If you're blocking lipolysis and all this fat that you've stored is not, it's not getting flushed out of the cells, then how are you going to lose weight? Well, the fat cells themselves can actually process a lot of this fat. And really what's controlling how much of this fat you're processing, even if it stays in the adipocytes, is actually your basal metabolic rate. There's an old drug which is now banned in the United States, but remarkably effective to this day. It's called dinitrophenol, and it's basically a metabolic uncoupler. It drastically increases your metabolic rate to the point where it can kill you through hyperthermia. And that's why FDA has banned it. However, it used to be the standard drug, and I think FDA used to have an approval for it, to basically treat morbidly obese people in the early 20th century. Then, of course, people started taking it off-label, and it took matter into their own hands, and a lot of deaths occurred through the hyperthermia. So now it's banned. But what this drug does is essentially mimics taking thyroid hormone or anything else that uncouples your metabolism, so you're producing a lot more heat and not so much ATP. But your basal metabolic rate about doubles on the drug, and it's a very reliable way to lose weight without exercising and without increasing lipolysis, and really without even doing anything, without changing your diet in any way. So I think that there are ways to lose weight safely. I do like the carnivore diet, again, with a few caveats, at least a few additions that I would do. But I think glucose gets a lot of bad rap, even though glucose in many cases is more of a bystander than a direct cause. Similar example, cholesterol, dietary cholesterol. Not many people know, but in 2017, FDA reversed its dietary guidelines for cholesterol. It said You no longer need to worry about cholesterol. We've been telling you for 50 years that cholesterol is going to give you heart disease. Guess what? We were wrong. But what FDA didn't do, even though that study that came out on which this reversal was based, it also vindicated saturated fat. But FDA didn't touch that. I guess Big Pharma has to sell a lot of PUFA, and there's a lot of lobbying pro PUFA and anti. Anyway, so the study said you can eat all the cholesterol you want. It does not make difference in regards to cardiovascular disease risk. It's actually the cholesterol you synthesize, right? That is actually much more implicated, and not just the cholesterol, but the oxidized cholesterol. And the thing that leads to oxidized cholesterol is oxidative stress, production of reactive oxygen species, which seems to be happening when the metabolic cycle is blocked. The oxidative phosphorylation is blocked by something, and one of the most reliable metabolic inhibitors is the polyunsaturated fats. They're also raising levels of malondialdehyde, which is that indicator of lipid peroxidation. And it's the multiple studies demonstrated an almost perfect correlation between glycated hemoglobin and malondialdehyde. So there's something going on with the PUFA that's probably responsible for most of the glycation, advanced glycation end products, in which glucose participates, but simply because the glucose is not metabolized. Why is glucose not metabolized? Because too much fat is overcrowding the oxidative machinery in the cell, and it's preventing glucose from being oxidized. And the way this the biggest roadblock in this competition between fats and glucose happens at the level of pyruvate dehydrogenase. That enzyme is kind of like the rate limiting step of the oxidation of glucose. It links glycolysis to the oxidative phosphorylation. And fatty acids, if you oxidize too many of them, or higher than optimal, I should say higher than optimal, it results in a drop of this ratio of nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide plus, which is the oxidized version, and then there's also the reduced version, which is NADH. So NAD plus is the oxidized, NADH is the reduced one. And this ratio kind of indicates is an indication of your redox status. How much oxygen you're consuming, whether you have a buildup of electrons or deficiency of electrons. And invariably, we're seeing that in every chronic state, if you actually care to look, you have so-called an excess of electrons. You're heavily shifted towards reduction. And oxidizing too much fat will put you into that more reduced state. And as long as the NAD to the NADH ratio is lower than whatever pyruvate dehydrogenase needs to basically do to handle the pyruvate coming from glucose, you're going to accumulate pyruvate, a byproduct of glucose, and the cell doesn't like accumulation of pyruvate, and also the cell needs to restore its NAD balance because that's what's needed for the cell to be alive. So it's using pyruvate as an emergency oxidant to oxidize NADH back into NAD, but in the process, pyruvate gets converted to lactate. And we're seeing this in diabetes, in cancer, in cardiovascular, in Alzheimer's disease. They have a higher than optimal levels of lactic acid in the blood. Lactate, actually, not lactic acid. And again, if you give some of these people, not many studies have been done, most of them are being on animals, but some human studies, hence the drug ACP-MOX that was approved. If you give people drugs that either block lipolysis or somehow inhibit the oxidation of fat, their hyperinsulinemia and hyperglycemia disappear. There's a famous drug invented in the former USSR. It's now banned as a doping agent. It's called meldonium, also known as mildronate. And what this drug does is basically interferes with the oxidation of long-chain fatty acids by preventing their transport into the mitochondria. So it's in a sense, simplistically, fatty acid oxidation inhibitor. Indirectly. It doesn't directly mess with the process of their oxidation, but simply prevents the fatty acids from getting into the mitochondria. That drug to this day, used in over 30 European countries and other countries worldwide to actually treat type 2 diabetes. But its effects are actually opposite of that of stimulating fatty acid oxidation. It's the opposite. It's inhibiting it. And as soon as you inhibit the excessive fatty oxidation, not all of it, but the excess of it, which is seen in diabetic people and people with chronic conditions, the problems with blood glucose seem to disappear. And that seems to be largely the effect of things like aspirin and vitamin E and niacinamide. They're basically substances that restrain excessive lipolysis. I want to emphasize excessive, not baseline. We always need lipolysis because our muscles at rest predominantly burn fat. However, that changes when we're under exertion. Then, especially the heart, prefers glucose simply because the process of beta oxidation is slower, much slower than the glucose oxidation. And that if you need an emergency urge of energy, then the muscles would prefer to metabolically switch to glucose, right? So that's really the gist of it. The metabolic theory says glucose can be a problem, but only if you're already in a state that it basically results in its inhibited metabolism And a lot of that inhibition of metabolism can be traced to things like high stress hormones. Cortisol can inhibit glucose oxidation, can stimulate the fatty acid synthase, stimulates the deposition of fat. People with Cushing syndrome, which is a disease of overproduction of cortisol, every single one of them has central obesity and loss of muscle mass. So basically, they look like the lemon with the stick model. It's a lemon with basically 4 sticks, and those are the limbs. If you give them a drug that blocks cortisol, these people not only recover, but they enjoy sustained weight loss. I want to emphasize sustained because it's not that difficult to lose weight if you watch your calories and exercise and basically you're sensible about your life. It's difficult to keep the weight off after you've lost it. And I think a lot of people don't realize how much their metabolic rate declines as a result of the weight loss if the weight loss is done through means which result in loss of lean muscle mass as well. There's a show in the States called, I don't know if it's still running. It was called The Biggest Loser. What an apt name. And basically, they were forcing people through this, I think, 6 months of grueling regimen, which included fasting, caloric restriction, right? Basically, I think they also completely cut out sugar, exercise some ridiculous amounts of hours a day. Some of them got heart attacks during the show, which is, not surprising given how morbidly obese people are. Anyways, every single person who lost the weight and won the show, within 6 months, not only were they back to their original weight despite maintaining a caloric deficit, basically they stay on the diet that the show gave them, but they gain even more. So they were devastated. They said, "What's going on? I went through 6 months of hell. I lost all this weight, and now I'm basically I'm no longer in the show. So I'm eating the same restricted diet that you guys were giving me. I guess I no longer exercise, and now I'm gaining weight on fewer calories than before. Well, what's happening?" And the study that looked at these participants said that the basal metabolic rate declined between 40 and 50% as a result of the weight loss. Why? Because while they were fasting and exercising and all these things, yes, they were losing a lot of fat because the lipolysis was upregulated. However, they were also losing a lot of lean mass. And lean mass is the primary determinant of your resting metabolic rate. So the bioenergetic view says if you want to lose weight, the safer way to do it is build lean muscle mass, right? And basically, avoid the polyunsaturated fatty acids. Not only are they metabolic inhibitors, they're also an endocrine factor due to their unsaturatedness. Multiple studies back in the 60s and 70s showed that they act similar to estrogen. They can activate the hypothalamo-pituitary-adrenal axis, so they can put you in a state of chronic stress. And they're precursors to the, some of the most well-known inflammatory mediators, the prostaglandins, the leukotrienes, and the thromboxanes. Aspirin and many of the other non-steroid inflammatory drugs that are in wide use today are doing just that. They inhibiting the conversion of the polyunsaturated fats into these inflammatory mediators. So really the metabolic theory says raise your metabolic rate, keep stress lower because cortisol is not your friend. Neither is excessive insulin, but cortisol, by the way, they go hand in hand. People with hyperinsulinemia also have hypercortisolemia because the body seems to be regulating them in this way to prevent reactive hypoglycemia. So, which can put you in a coma or potentially even die. Type 1 diabetes can get that if they're not careful with the injecting too much insulin and not eating sufficient amount of glucose. They can actually die and go into hypoglycemic coma. But I think the mechanism the body has developed is that if your insulin is too high, the body says, "Oh my God, there's a danger of hypoglycemia. So let me raise cortisol reactively or adaptively," because the primary role of cortisol is actually not so much anti-inflammatory, but it is to keep blood glucose from falling too low. And the way cortisol does that is by shredding your muscle tissue and connective tissue, because most of them are made of amino acids. And then these amino acids get converted into glucose through the process of gluconeogenesis, which cortisol, by the way, upregulates. And I think that's why these recent studies with humans, type 2 diabetes, that show that 90% of the blood glucose, the elevated blood glucose, is coming from gluconeogenesis, not from the diet. When they gave them an anti-cortisol drug, gluconeogenesis went back to normal, and these people, at least the metabolic biomarkers, seem to normalize completely. Now, they didn't immediately lose weight, but most of these studies lasted only a few months because these people are in such a poor health. The goal was to normalize them biochemically and then worry about their weight later.
Well, I would agree with quite a lot of that, and so I think we have a lot of crossover on what we're talking, especially with the PUFAs and things like that. Those things are absolutely toxic. They absolutely destroy the normal functioning of our mitochondria, and then that's probably one of the main drivers of the chronic disease state that we are seeing now in the modern Western world. And so I think that the only things that I would sort of point out, first of all, it was my understanding that people with type 2 diabetes, or actually is a number of these people with metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, anywhere from 20 to 40%, depending on the studies you look at, that actually are not overweight or obese. They're actually normal weight. So that is a bit difficult. There, he's like, they don't have, the high sort of fat obesity sort of content that you're talking about there. And also, I certainly agree that this is a lot more complex than just, carbs go up, diabetes happens. There's so much more going on in our biochemistry. And it's very intricate. And so when you start, giving someone I hadn't heard of that study. That's amazing. 7 grams of aspirin is pretty impressive.
I'll say it after that. It's a human study.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Coming from a surgeon standpoint, my first reaction is, "Oh, sweet Jesus, no!" You're just gonna,
they'll bleed to death, right?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So you see people, all of a sudden, coming in, they have a bad headache. They take a couple aspirin and come in, and they have a cerebral bleed, and you're just like, "Oh, it's Jesus, no, why?" So the aspirin is not the friend of the surgeon, certainly. But that's very interesting. I do think that, it has its role though, right? Because this is happening in a complex system. And so, unless we take medications, we're not going to disrupt those metabolic processes. And so, glucose has a role. And so your blood sugar is going to go up. You're going to have these sorts of problems. So yes, you can certainly temper these reactions and your metabolism with medications. And it's certainly interesting to see the mechanisms and all the interplay. But, if you're not taking these medications and we're just looking at how our body just works naturally, there is that interplay. There are those things going on. In a lot of these, obviously with the Randall cycle, which I totally agree with, that would then, further my argument of just saying, don't eat carbs, just let your body just run on fat and keep going that way. Ozempic, is one of these drugs that shows a lot of great weight loss. Just like with the Biggest Loser, though, it does seem when people stop it, they get a rebounding effect and actually put on more weight than they lost. And so we're going to see it, what that does to all these people who are on it. I mean, I was just at the pharmacy the other day picking up some antihistamines for my girlfriend, and there's a sign there that said there's an Ozempic shortage. So this is really getting out there. So hopefully that doesn't come crashing down. But if you're not taking these drugs and you're just allowing your system, to work in its normal fashion, glucose can matter, and eating carbohydrates can affect these sorts of things. Cortisol is a major factor. And there are studies in a lot in mice. I've seen some in pediatric populations that go on a ketogenic diet for epilepsy, and they find a marginal increase in their cortisol. But I've also seen other studies that, went on a ketogenic diet, and there are thousands of studies with, showing the benefits of a ketogenic diet, and not even like the ketogenic diet I would ascribe to, which is, just meat-based, because you can have a ketogenic diet that sort of means anything. It just means no carbs, and they can actually be high in polyunsaturated fatty acids and things like that, which I don't think would be a good idea. And a lot of these plants and vegetables that have all these sorts of defense chemicals that aren't great for you. But even then, there are a number of studies that I've found, some that actually showed that after 8 weeks on a ketogenic diet, they actually found a lowering of their cortisol. Some people argue that the other, because there's a lot of studies that show one way or the other, and some people argue that it's potentially a marginal rise in cortisol in some populations because they may have been actually deficient in cortisol. Metabolic syndrome is known to suppress your cortisol, and then this may be coming back to physiological levels. Again, going back to first principles, I do think that this is our normal way of eating. And so if we're finding that our cortisol is slightly higher in that context, I would sort of assume, or at least think, that could be physiological. There are other studies. There's one that followed obese patients for 24 months. They had significant weight loss, and there's a statistically significant. They reduced their cholesterol, raised HDL, lowered LDL, lowered triglycerides, reduced their blood sugar significantly. Didn't have any change in urea, creatinine, kidney function, anything like that. But they found that this ameliorated all the metabolic complications associated with hypercortisolism. And in fact, there are actual studies that argue, or even treatments that are in place now for people with both ACTH dependent and independent cortisol hypersecretion, that a ketogenic diet is advised during and after surgery or medical management of the primary cause of this. So while in some studies or in some people it may raise cortisol, it does seem to ameliorate and correct the symptoms of hypercortisolism. And so I think that lends evidence to the fact that if we're sort of eating a more natural diet, that even if our cortisol goes up or down, the effects of like Cushing's is a devastating illness for people. But and obviously you don't want that, and I don't want anybody to get that. Certainly not off something that I'm suggesting that they do. But it does appear that people on a ketogenic diet seem to fix those problems. And so maybe their cortisol goes up or down a bit, but the problems associated with hypercortisolism get better on a ketogenic diet, which a carnivore diet is. I haven't checked my cortisol specifically because I just haven't really cared to. I haven't thought.
You don't look like you have high cortisol.
Yeah. I have checked it in some of my patients who have been on carnivore for 2-3 years. They've been normal. They've had normal cortisol levels, normal insulin levels, normal HbA1c and blood glucose and things like that. There's more than one way to skin a cat, and there are definitely ways that you can lose weight. Lots of ways. I mean, I used to eat carbs. I used to eat a very normal diet, not an ultra processed diet. I was never into that. And I played sports and I got into shape and I got very lean. You can do it. I found it's a lot easier to do it eating just meat and not eating the sugar and carbs. Even when I would drink milk, like I love milk, I have to stop myself from drinking milk because I just want to drink more of it. And so I don't like that response. I don't like my body sort of, wanting to crave something. But I noticed I ran an experiment where I was just like, like the Maasai do it, like maybe some high fat milk, maybe adding a bit of, cream into whole milk. Can I just run on that? And I did that for a few days and felt fine. Everything was fine. But I did notice I started to get a little chubby. I'm like, okay, maybe we'll stop that now. And went back to just eating fatty steaks and, leaned back up. And so, I think that, like, again, there are a number of different ways to do this. I've found that the biochemical state that we get into when we're on a carnivore diet and excluding these other things, even milk and dairy, that seems to be easier for people to lose weight and gain health. And that's my main issue is gaining health. And you can give Ozempic and that can increase the secretion of insulin and that can help with weight loss. But, what's that high insulin level doing to you over the years? I think that can be a problem as well.
Yeah, the reason I mentioned Ozempic is not that I advertise or suggest it in any way. It's only to illustrate that sometimes insulin promoters can be weight loss inducing. However, with the price of potentially getting acute pancreatitis, which can be deadly. And that's a known side effect of most of these newer drugs. And I think it's a terrible tragedy that people are jumping on the bandwagon of the Ozempic simply because it's like it's a pill or it's an injection. So it's an easy fix. They go to the doctor, injects them once a week with something, and then they lose weight. Well, you either have to stay on this for life and risk acute pancreatitis, which eventually will kill you. Potentially may even give you pancreatic cancer if it becomes chronic inflammatory chronic pancreatitis. Not many people know, but Steve Jobs, an interesting anecdote, had chronic pancreatitis for years because of his primarily fruitarian diet. He ate almost no protein and almost nothing else except fruits. I don't know exactly what kind of fruits he ate, and eventually he died of pancreatic cancer. What's his name? Ashton Kutcher, who did the biopic on Jobs, put himself on the same diet. And if you go on Google and type and look it up, he ended up in the hospital twice during the movie production, twice with acute pancreatitis. So it freaked him out, and his doctor said, whatever you're eating, you better stop it now because, I don't want you to end up like Steve Jobs. So something about these extreme diets, basically, and the fruitarian diet is almost entirely carbs. I think it's an indication that you can actually err in the side of like eating too many carbs, especially if they're not balanced by the other macronutrients. But as far as the ketogenic diet lowering cortisol, some of them lowering, the other one raising, my explanation is it will be due to the composition of the fat of the diet. Now, if PUFAs are activating cortisol release and they're also precursors to inflammatory mediators, of course the body will adapt to raise cortisol even more to handle the inflammation, right? Saturated fats actually have a very different. They act as ACTH antagonists, many of them, and the medium to short chain fatty acids are also GABA agonists. And several human studies demonstrated if you give strong GABA agonists, you can actually treat Cushing syndrome. You can keep the cortisol. It's not going to cure the tumor if it's a pituitary origin or adrenal origin, but it will keep the cortisol levels normal. And I think the saturated fats, if you're eating carnivore diet where the meat is predominantly from ruminant animals, because they mostly produce the saturated fats, I think that will mimic they will give you the anti-cortisol effect because of these saturated fats. If you're eating mostly pork and chicken, and especially the fatty portion of the pork, lard has acquired this mythical status of high saturated fat diet in animal studies, yet it's not true. Actually, the pigs, the fat composition they're very similar to us. Whatever you feed them, that's the kind of fat that they're going to deposit. And if you're feeding them mostly grains, and now the seed oils are mostly made from these seeds, right, including grains, then they're going to get predominantly polyunsaturated fats in their diet. So I think the carnivore diet has great potential if you're careful about the meat that you're eating, right, ruminant animals mostly, and maybe lean chicken, lean birds, things like that. And basically making sure that the fat that you're ingesting is predominantly of the saturated and the monounsaturated kind. Limit PUFA intake as much as possible. Interestingly, there is a study with rats which was testing what would PUFA depletion, because PUFA is considered essential still in medical circles to my knowledge, what would PUFA depletion do to rats? So they made these rats basically deficient on PUFA by feeding them coconut oil. And these rats became impossible to, first of all, they never got cancer throughout their lifetime. Second, when they try to basically inject them with several different types of rat tumors, the cell culture never took hold. Basically, the rat organism killed it. So they were extremely resistant to being killed by tumorigenesis, by endotoxemia. They injected them with endotoxin, and it took 20 times, I think, the lethal amount that normally would take to kill a rat to kill these, right? And these rats, all they ate was basically coconut oil, and I think meat was basically dried, defatted meat, from if I remember correctly, plus the addition of coconut oil. They did not eat any carbs. So it shows that maybe it really is PUFA that is basically the main driver of all of these things. And if you can eliminate the PUFA, then you can probably eat, and of course, avoiding the plants, but they are also very high on PUFA. Then after that, you can probably eat pretty much whatever you want, but the things that remain are not that many, which is milk, eggs, and meat.
Well, I 100% agree with all that. So yeah, there's definitely no disagreement there. Yeah.
Lots of good stuff. We could probably go on for a long time. I think the main thing to take is a little bit of self-experimentation, right? I think everyone's a little bit different. I've noticed that with myself. I was fairly meat-based. I've added in some fruits after talking with Georgi and Jay Feldman. And it's interesting. I originally put on a little weight, but it actually came back. Eating the same amount, I added about 700 calories, but my weight, and then put on weight, then 4 to 6 months later, the weight came back to my normal, and I was still eating the more calories and adding in the fruit. So, I think something to be said about increasing metabolic rate. And I think the big thing that, Georgi talks a lot about is fat is almost like using fat as fuel is almost like a backup system. And, like you've talked about, Georgi, how fasting and even low carb can sort of maybe even slow down metabolic rate potentially, while, you should look more towards increasing metabolic rate by maybe eating more and adding in some whole food carbs. And this might actually be more optimal, because a lot of times if we look ancestrally, yes, there's ancestors that ate a lot of rice, right? And there's ancestors that ate a lot of meat. So that you can see both extremes. But I think most importantly is, what is optimal, not necessarily what was done ancestrally. And so, everyone's got to sort of go through their self-experimentation. But, I felt it was important to get, both perspectives on and to discuss, these two variables.
With one clarification, when you're fasting, and which of course results in upregulated lipolysis, I think the reason we're getting the anti-metabolic effect is not necessarily the fat per se, but unfortunately, when we're eating fats that are of mixed nature, there's saturated fat, PUFA, and monounsaturated fat, the body seems to prioritize the oxidation of the saturated and monounsaturated fats, while the PUFA is predominantly stored. So conversely, when we're doing when we're fasting and basically in a state of elevated lipolysis, we'll be releasing predominantly PUFA from the stores, and that I think will cause that's probably the main driver behind many of these bad effects that we're seeing from basically elevated free fatty acids in the blood, is because most of them are actually polyunsaturated fats. If you look at babies, they're in ketosis, I think, for the first week or something of when they're born. But the fats that are in their blood, if you compare the fatty acid profile, it is heavily shifted in favor of saturated fat. They're about like 90% saturated fat, and babies don't seem to be getting any problems with elevated lipolysis. However, if you take a type 2 diabetic and you basically stress them out, and they flood their blood with these polyunsaturated fats, now multiple studies have come out and said the kidney damage that we're seeing in diabetes, especially acute kidney injury, the acute pancreatitis that we're seeing in sometimes in type 2 diabetic patients, cardiovascular disease, like the actual heart attack. A lot of these things are actually caused by the predominance of the polyunsaturated fat acids in the blood when they're released due to stress from the stores. So if you're going to be losing weight through lipolysis, I think it will help if you're taking something like vitamin E just to keep the peroxidation in check, and also maybe taking like a spoon of coconut oil maybe a couple of times a day, because multiple studies show that it's the ratio of the saturated fat to the polyunsaturated fat in the blood that also determines to a great degree how much damage the PUFA would do. Not just directly PUFA itself, because it's unsaturated, it can peroxidize, but also the saturated fats are inhibitors of the COX and LOX pathways through which the PUFA produces most of these inflammatory mediators. So if you're going to be doing lipolysis, my suggestion would be to make sure you have an antioxidant, like such as vitamin E, and or consume an addition of easily metabolizable saturated fats as found in coconut oil or beef tallow. But most people are not going to eat beef tallow. A spoon of beef tallow just doesn't sound very appetizing. But refined coconut oil is tasteless and odorless, so it shouldn't be that much of a problem to add a tablespoon a couple of times a day.
I would agree with that. I think there's so many things, and I would even submit that, while I think that carbs and sugar can be problematic, I do think that the PUFAs and omega-6s are worse, and I think that they're a major driver of our disease state and so many different problems, that we're contending with now. There's a great book that came out by Dr. Chris Kenobi, and it's just called The Ancestral Diet Revolution. It just came out recently, and he really argues that this really is the seed oils. This really is the PUFAs and things like that. And he shows a lot of very good evidence. He has like over 1,300 scientific references in this book. It's very well researched and cited. So it's it does seem that there is a very strong connection between not only disease but obesity. That we see people in obese populations, the more overweight they are, they actually have a higher percentage of omega-6s, that they're storing in their body. And there's a few traditional populations alive right now that have very, very high saturated fats, like the Maasai, and I forget the name of the tribe, but it's one of the Pacific Islands, and they just drink a ton of coconut milk, a lot of coconut, and fish and things like that. No carbs, so very high saturated fat diet, really no carbs, very lean, very healthy, very strong, just like the Maasai. And then in Papua New Guinea, there's a tribe, they will eat some pig, but they don't eat as much. But a lot of their diet are yams. They have like sweet potatoes, right? There's like 100 different varieties of sweet potatoes that use. So actually a majority of their calories come from these carbohydrates, from these sweet potatoes. But because they're not getting any of the seed oils, and nothing's processed, they're again lean, strong, healthy, not getting these rates of disease. So I do agree that I think that the PUFAs are a major driver of disease. They're just not natural. They didn't even exist 100 years ago. And so cottonseed oil in the late 1800s, and Crisco and canola oil, and after that, like in the 50s and things like that with canola oil, stuff is toxic. I mean, it just doesn't exist in our diet at all. It never existed in our diet before that. So how are we going to argue that this is biologically, that we're biologically designed for something that didn't exist, when we were being designed? Yeah. So I definitely agree with that. There's as far as antioxidants are concerned, this is a good thing about, sort of eating, high meat-based diet is again, your urea is going to go up. And this is one of our body's strongest antioxidants. And so this is going to carry a lot of that weight and a lot of that burden for people in an antioxidant point of view. You can obviously take other antioxidants like, vitamin E and things like that. I wouldn't do it in the plant form, because while plants do have antioxidants, they also have a lot of oxidants. And so they don't, that can definitely offset. And then just the last thing would be, there are some studies that show that that you can actually get an increase in your basal metabolic rate. There was a study out of the BMJ in 2018 looking at the effects of low carbohydrate diet on energy expenditure during weight loss. This was a randomized trial, and they found that in the very restrictive carbohydrate group, so they really were restricting carbohydrates the most, that they had on average, they had 278 kilocalories more per day of energy expenditure, and in the low carb but not no carb group was better than just the normal carb group. That's not the only factor. I'm definitely in agreement with that, and I'm sure there are a lot of other factors that go into that. But I do think that that there's a lot of evidence for a ketogenic diet, and with the caveat, that an important caveat, that the studies that look at and the people that use more animal fat, more saturated fat, do better. Yeah. And there are studies with ketogenic diets with cancer that showed very good results, and there's one that have middling results. And I think that's probably the distinction there. Also, some of them will look and say, this is a ketogenic diet and you can eat as much as 50 grams a day. And I would say, no, you can't. Especially when we're dealing with something like cancer. But but some of the studies with looking at carbohydrate or carbohydrate restrictive diets like ketogenic diet, some of the ones that will have middling results, you'll notice that they don't limit PUFAs, they don't prioritize saturated fats and things like that. And I think that's a major reason why you see a difference.
So maybe the big takeaway is, if you're eating high carb diet, you better keep fat low, because all those carbs, and the instant that they raise, they're going to prevent the fat from being oxidized, so you're going to store it almost completely. If you're eating a high fat diet, then it's probably not a good idea to eat also a lot of carbs with it, because the fat diet is going to prevent the metabolism of the glucose, and it's going to float around, cause all kinds of problems, increase lactic acid, high blood pressure, etc., etc. So, and then if you're eating the high fat diet, of course, goes without saying, make sure it's predominantly saturated. So maybe both pathways are okay. It's really when these two macronutrients clash, and especially because they are competitive in nature when it comes to their metabolism, and especially if you're eating the PUFA, which is also has an extra anti-metabolic effect of its own, and inflammatory, then really all hell breaks loose. It would be better to eat predominantly one or the other, and if you're eating the fat, it would be mostly saturated. That will be my takeaway, I think, from this discussion.
No, I would definitely agree with that as well. That's why people saying, well, you need a varied diet, you need to sort of eat everything. It's like, no, you really don't want to do that. You want to be very limited. The diet is very specific in nature, and it needs to be for us as well. All animals eat very specific things, and that's due to their biological design, and we're animals. And so, those same physiological and biological laws apply. And so, yeah, I would agree with that. That again, there's more than one way of doing things. I think that just carnivore is probably a very good way, if not the best way, at least from what I've found in from my research. But yeah, if you're doing one or the other, and you're being careful about that and limiting or eliminating PUFAs, then I think you can get very good results either way.
Yeah, there's a tribe called the Tsimane. They're in the Amazon, and they eat 90% carbohydrates, mostly from tubers. They eat almost no fat, simply because it's not available. And basically, whatever protein they get is either they killed some fish. Tropical fish is mostly saturated fat and protein, or some animals in the trees, because they live in the jungle. And these people I think they have no confirmed case of cardiovascular disease, despite on autopsy, because they have autopsy, some of them, they do have the lesions in their basically in their arteries, but for some reason that plaque never separates and causes a clogging. And their levels of the inflammatory biomarkers such as CRP and erythrocyte sedimentation rate and interleukin 1 and 6 are about 1/3 of what we're seeing in the Western populations. So I think plenty of examples that the native cultures know what they're doing and they can adapt to whatever nature provides there, and they can thrive as long as they're not being fed these mass-produced empty calories, basically, which were created for only one reason, and that is profit, and they were never designed with health in mind.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I'll just finish off with just one point in the sense that, like, I think the goal is optimal health, and optimal health is more than just looking at weight loss. I mean, I think that's one aspect of it, but, you know, great energy, restorative sleep, clear skin, good libido, peaceful mood, low stress, you know, lean muscle mass, well-functioning gut. I think these are all pillars and things that we should look at other than just having a six-pack, right? So I think that's just something to keep in mind as we move on. And yeah, so we can talk about a lot of things, but I'll say that, like, going carnivore, keto, or low carb, which I did for quite a while, is great, especially if you're just coming off standard American diet. I mean, even going vegetarian is a better move from the standard American diet. So you can get improved outcomes both ways. But, you know, obviously I would advise, and just, you know, with you, like we talked about today, is, you know, eating more protein, cutting out gut stressors, removing seed oils, and increasing saturated fats, and then eliminating junk food, I think, are just a good place to start. And, you know, you can titrate carbs how you like, depending on how you're feeling and things like that. I've grown to sort of enjoy bringing back some whole food carbs, because I think we say carbs, and that's such a broad term. You know, there's refined carbs, and there's some whole food carbs that I think could possibly be beneficial. But again, it's sort of that self-experimentation.
And I would add avoiding chronic stress, because the sympathetic and parasympathetic system are antagonizing each other. So as long as you're under chronic stress, no matter how optimally you eat, a lot of that food is not going to go towards its the goals and the purposes that it was meant to be. Basically, high cortisol slows down digestion, inhibits the release of a lot of the enzymes from the pancreas, such as lipase, amylase, and protease. So you're not going to be digesting as much of the food. And then, of course, it makes the intestine, the enterochromaffin cells in the intestine, produce a lot more serotonin. So you're going to have gut imbalances. Your digestion will be suffering. So if you're under chronic stress, I think that needs to be addressed as well, because if that does not get addressed, I think ultimately, no diet is going to help you. And chronic stress is now recognized as perhaps the main factor behind cardiovascular disease and probably cancers, and lately even Alzheimer's disease. So if you're working 12 hours a day, and you feel like you're killing yourself, then I think the diet is not going to help much. Of course, it always helps to eat more healthy, but I think the elephant in the room would be, we're not meant to be in a chronic fight or flight response 12 hours out of the day. In nature, when the gazelle is being chased by the lion, it lasts maybe 30 seconds. Either the lion catches it or the gazelle runs away, and then the stress for both animals goes down, right? Not 12 hours a day. There's this hyper activation of the adrenal system that we're currently living under, and I think for most people in the Western world it's like that. I think that can also be a very big factor in chronic disease, and it can undermine a lot of the positive effects of dietary choices. And people are like, well, I changed my diet, now I'm eating all the healthy foods, and I'm still sick. Well, if your cortisol is high, then, if it's higher than normal and it stays elevated longer than what is optimal, then you're probably not going to be in optimal health long term.
Well said.
Yeah. Just to add to that, there was an interesting study looking at cardiovascular disease, and it was an interventional trial, and looking at stress. And so they had people meditate for 40 minutes a day. That was it. That was the only intervention, and they found that they actually were able to reverse their atherosclerotic plaques just by meditating. So no medications or additions or dietary changes. So just that conscious de-stressing actually was clinically proven to actually reverse cardiovascular disease. So it's one of the few things that has. There are other studies that have come out from, like Dr. Amara in the U.S. showing that reducing visceral fat can actually remove blockages as well, and revitalize the cerebral vascular perfusion on imaging, showing that this is objectively improving that as well. But I really thought that was interesting. Also, caffeine, we're quite reliant on caffeine, and that can raise cortisol and raise your stress and put you in that sort of hyper vigilant state a lot as well. So, I think that's very good advice. Diet is a major piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only one. You have to optimize other parts of your life as well. And if you're feeling like, you're overworked and your job is killing you, it probably is, and I've found that optimizing other parts of your life, like diet and so on, and not relying on caffeine, that has allowed me to work stupid hours and not be stressed out and not be freaked out and be able to weather that pretty well as well. So it all comes together. It's all a package. It's not just one thing that's going to fix everything. You need everything working well together for optimal health.
Totally agree. Well, this was great, guys. Maybe in a few months we'll get part 2 going. But where's the best place, Georgi? Where's the best place for people to find you? I know you got your blog. Well,
that's pretty much it. Okay. The blog is haidut.me, haidut.me, and that feeds into Twitter, where basically it's twitter.com/haidut, the same alias. I used to answer personal emails, but people would start really overwhelming me with their medical histories and such. And I also don't want to get into a situation where because they're obviously asking for diagnosis, treatment, and obviously I'm not a doctor, and I always advise them to go to the doctor. But if they had poor experience with the medical system, many of them have given up on it, or at least they don't interact with their doctor as often as they should be. So they're kind of relying on me for that. I don't want that. I mean, I'm kind of trying to move away from that. So I post, I think, enough for people to be making conscious decisions of what to show to their doctor and decide with their doctor or healthcare provider what to do or what not to do. I don't want to be in a position where I'm giving advice of what to do and what not to do.
Yeah, and I'll definitely put links in the show notes. And Dr. Chaffee, best place for people to find you?
I have a YouTube channel. It's just my name, Anthony Chaffee, MD, as well as my Instagram is the same as Anthony Chaffee, MD. That's where I sort of do most of my posts and things like that. And I have a podcast called The Plant Free MD, just to telegraph that right there. That's sort of my thing. And then I'm on Twitter, Anthony_Chaffee. And those are the main ones. And people can find me through that.
Excellent. Well, again, appreciate you guys getting together on different time zones, and we made it work. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I understand there are millions of other podcasts out there, and you've chosen to listen to mine, and I appreciate that. Check out the show notes at briangrin.com for everything that was mentioned in this episode. Feel free to subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend or family member that's looking to get their body back to what it once was. Thanks again, and have a great day.